Birgit, when your husband was dying from an incurable illness, you sensed several phenomena which gave you insights into what your husband was experiencing mentally. Could you explain further the circumstances and what you experienced? By all means. My husband was diagnosed with a brain tumor 10 years ago, but the tumor was so large that it was inoperable. Well, it was a shock for us at the time, yet my husband was determined to carry on living, and we wanted so much to keep him. My husband was an active person who loved living close to nature. He went on lots of hikes in the mountains, and the best thing for him was to hike up a mountain and look down from the top. He also liked sailing. In short, he loved life, and his family was very important to him. Well, we didn't want to give him up, and as to his disease, he was doing everything that could be done: chemotherapy, radiotherapy, antibody therapy, and he also did a lot of physical therapy in order to be able to maintain his mobility for a long time, because the whole tumor was localized in the motion center. So actually, only the motion center was affected. But this was, of course, particularly bad for him because he loved doing sports and exercise. But after all, he was able to continue doing all of this for another 5 years and to live with it. But he was really paralyzed in his last few weeks of life. However, even at the very end, he was still completely clear-headed and could still talk, but in his last days, he could only communicate through his eyes. So by closing his eyes, he meant yes, and by opening his eyes wide, he meant no. He was doing meditation as well, so we also tried natural healing methods at an ecological center, including acupuncture and homeopathy. We tried everything, but things still continued worsening, and this was really quite sad for us all. My husband was a natural scientist. In fact, most of my family members are natural scientists. Well, these things, like having exceptional experiences, are then quickly talked out of one's head. My husband wasn't that interested in this either. It was the natural sciences that were important to him. He was a chemist, so it was physics, chemistry, and mathematics that interested him the most. Exactly 2 months before my husband's death, I celebrated a belated birthday with friends. First, we took a train to the theater, where we saw a theater play. Thereafter, we went for dinner and returned home via the train. In the theater, we sat in one of the balconies upstairs, and my girlfriends were sitting to my right. But for me, I was totally sad, and actually, I didn't feel much like being in the theater at all. So I was just sitting there sadly. And all of a sudden, I saw my husband approaching me to my left. He was standing directly at a balustrade looking down. And before I could get a closer look at him, he was gone. And I thought, this can't be true. This was definitely my husband. The whole apparition was so clear and so real. Did you dream this, or what was it? I just couldn't understand it. And when I got home, I immediately went to my husband and told him, it's really weird. I had this real feeling that you were there with me. And he replied, yes, I was with you in the theater. And when I asked him what he meant, he said, well, I just leave my body, then I travel. And so I said to him, oh, that must be exciting. And he replied, his eyes shining, yes, it's really exciting. He had also been somewhere else in the meantime, to a place I also knew and where we had once been. And when I asked him what he was doing there, he said, well, I just listen to what people say. My daughters were at our house at the time to help me. For this, they had taken special, unpaid leave, especially for this purpose, and they were with him when I was in the theater. And when I asked them what he was doing at this point in time, they said he had been asleep the whole time. Anyway, there is a backstory to the whole thing. As a teenager, I was very interested in the topic of near-death experiences. I was a student in a convent, and one of the nuns, whom we all loved, offered us the opportunity to meditate with her after class. So I, too, joined in. I got very deeply into this meditation, and I felt it was good for me, so that I performed better in class. I also became more intuitive. I was able to concentrate better and graduated with really good grades, thereby able to achieve the required average grade to qualify for the closed number classes, or what they call numerus clausus, so that now I could do what I really wanted to do. I wanted to study medicine. However, toward the end, but when I was still a teenager, I had a very frightening experience in meditation when I felt I was in a huge, infinite space. And when I imagine infinity, then this was it. I heard orchestral music, and I was so frightened that I wanted to get out of the whole thing, but I couldn't move. In retrospect, I think this could have been so-called sleep paralysis. And when I was out of it all, I thought to myself, now stop with all those things. You are here now, and you are living here now. And these near-death experiences, and so on, well, I would have liked to experience it, such a near-death experience, but not on condition of almost dying. So I thought to myself, you have to be here now. You are alive, and you will experience it when you yourself will one day die. In any case, when I came home and my husband told me about going on such trips, I was, of course, immediately as interested as I was back then. And so I asked him a few questions. I asked him, well, is there really an afterlife? And he replied, yes, there is 100%, yes. So he was 100% convinced that this afterlife exists. And when I then asked him whether God exists, he asked a counter question. Well, what is God? Maybe he wanted to know what I imagined it to be. I also asked him what it was like in the afterlife, whereupon he said, I am wondering about all these things that you would like to know. And when I objected as to whether this couldn't be told, he said, no, it's so difficult to explain. Well, he was already very exhausted, that he couldn't say much more. You told me in our preliminary conversation that your husband had also spoken to other people. Yes, that's right. And this was before I had this experience in the theater. Once I came into his room to find him lying there, looking back up to the left corner of the ceiling, saying, rather frightened, yes, yes. And I thought, oh my God, what's wrong with him now? Oh, the poor chap. And I too was frightened. But at some point, it was over. And later on, after this experience, it happened several times that he said, yes, okay, goodbye. And I asked him, who are you talking to? Whereupon he said that his parents had just been there. And when once again I felt like he was talking to or communicating with someone I couldn't see, he said to me, now my father was just there. So I also asked him if my nephew, who had recently passed on, had been there also. And he said, yes, he was there too. So I said, what do they want from you after all? And he just smiled a bit as if he would like to say, what can I do? They just simply would like to pick me up. So he communicated regularly with the deceased before passing away? Yes, indeed. And when my husband was in his last days, we just couldn't give him up, just simply because we were so sad. And 2 weeks before he died, we kept feeling he's going to go now. But he continued to stay with us. And during the last night, just before he died, we constantly had to get up to turn him over, because he could no longer do it anymore himself. Thereafter, it took him an hour and a half to recover from that, and despite wearing an oxygen mask, he could hardly breathe. So that I said to him, I can't take it any longer. You can go. So he moved his eyelids downwards, and this meant, all right. I then asked him if he was frightened, whereupon He opened his eyes wide, and this in turn meant, no, I am not scared. After the funeral, then, I told of the extraordinary things I had experienced. And a neighbor friend of mine told me that as a child, she was able to see her deceased grandmother. So it seemed to happen to her quite often that she could see or perceive the dead. And she told me at the funeral, where there were still many other people present, that my husband was delighted and amazed that so many people had come to his funeral. Two of my husband's friends then gave funeral speeches, and one of them told me about an experience that my husband had also told me about earlier. So he had gone sailing with my husband. My husband was an excellent sailor, and they had been caught in a storm while sailing. And back then, my husband had told it all to me. Well, it must have been a very traumatic experience for this friend. And even though it wasn't that bad for my husband, this friend described how bad all this was. And my neighbor then told me that my husband laughed out loud, saying, now he's exaggerating. And that's exactly what he would have done in reality. It just seemed very authentic. Well, there was still another incident after the funeral. At the time, my eldest grandson was 2 years old, and we went for a walk. My daughters had already gone on ahead, and I followed them with my grandson, who suddenly stopped as if thunderstruck, saying, there's Grandpa. I asked him, well, where is he? Whereupon he pointed to a certain direction where no one was to be seen. And when I asked him what Grandpa was saying, he replied, hello. So I said, well, say hello to him too. And he did so. Then we continued walking on. It also seems to be not that rare for people to leave their bodies and travel before dying. So one of my husband's brothers told me that he was at the deathbed of a neighbor friend who said to him, you wouldn't believe how much I travel. And to come back to what my little grandson experienced, an acquaintance told me that after her husband's favorite aunt had passed on, she approached him on the street, beaming with joy, of course, at some point. Then she was gone. And I had another wonderful experience that happened after my husband's funeral, which was in January, when it was so cold. It was snowing. And now, a month after my husband had been buried, I took a photo of the grave. Over the whole grave, there was a huge blanket of snow. And about 4 days later, I took another photo because a flower from the floral decoration had made its way up through the snow, and I showed this photo to others too, because I myself had never seen anything like this before, and they too confirmed that they had never seen anything like this before. And someone said it was kind of a nice greeting from the hereafter. And so later on, you visited a medium to find out something about your deceased husband. Yes, I was really so desperate, and a friend of mine proposed that I should go to her friend and receive some advice. What she didn't tell me was that this friend was a medium. And actually, I never had much to do with mediums previously, but I was in the habit of speaking with this particular woman when I was in despair. So as I had spoken to her previously, I called her again when things were really starting to get worse. And she said that she didn't believe that my husband would live on, but that he would have to go, and that I should consult a medium only 6 months after he had died. And so she would give me the address of a medium. It was my understanding that before visiting a medium, you should never say what it's all about. The medium should not know anything about the consultant or the reason why one has come for a consultation, so that no information given prior to the reading can influence it. So sometime previous to his death, I said to my husband, if I survive you, I will consult a medium, where I would like to hear 2 words from you. I didn't know yet exactly which ones. I just wanted to have proof in order to know it was really him. So I didn't really think of anything else than the title of a book, Bunny in Australia, which I had read shortly beforehand and that I found very funny. And that explains why I wanted to hear the words rabbit and Australia. The nickname Rabbit also suited my husband quite well because my mother-in-law, who was from the country, used to always give nicknames. And she nicknamed my husband Rabbit Man because we had had our children so quickly after our wedding. And later on, I nicknamed my husband Rabbit, but by using the Spanish name for rabbit, that is conejo, also because he was often called Connie. Well, this suited him really quite well. We have never been to Australia, but I would have liked to hear these two words. Well, I called this medium and told her that my husband had passed away and that I would like to consult her. She said I could do an audio recording, and finally, she said that my husband and my father-in-law were here. They were present. But to be honest, I didn't really listen to what the medium was saying because I definitely wanted to hear the words rabbit and Australia. But unfortunately, I did not. And the medium said she didn't work like that because it would be too difficult. Anyway, I listened to the audio recording afterwards, and it was really unbelievable what she said. And she could not have known all this. Things that happened in the family, that there were conflicts in the family because of my father-in-law's care. She also made me understand that my husband, she didn't say that he had a brain tumor, but she just pointed to the spot on his head where the tumor had been located. She also told me that my husband was pointing right there also. For him, it obviously felt extremely bad finding himself more and more locked up in his body, and also that ultimately he was still dependent on an oxygen device. There was still another message, and the medium could not have known all of this. After my husband's death, a day to a month later, sometimes I was lying on my bed feeling very sad, and suddenly my eyes closed, and it felt like someone was standing to my right, grabbing my shoulder. I jumped up in fright. I looked around but didn't see anyone, so I asked, "Was that you just now, Connie?" Sometimes I felt like I can hear him in my head, but I said to myself, well, we had been together for 40 years. I know him. So I just simply knew what he would have said. I also often felt someone's presence in the room, even though I didn't see anyone. I just felt a presence. Then I used to say, "Tell me, is that you?" So when I was with this medium, she put her arm on her shoulder, saying, "Your husband says that you sometimes feel or hear him. Then you ask yourself whether it's him or not. And now he clearly would like to confirm that it's him and that he is with you very often. And he would like to tell you that it's really him." She further asked me if I have a daughter. So I have 3 daughters. There's something about a daughter, something he's so happy about. I said that I would soon be visiting one of my daughters. "Maybe that's it," she said. So I conceded that maybe one daughter is pregnant, and the medium casted some doubt on this. But afterwards, it turned out that even 2 of my daughters were pregnant. Well, after my visit to this medium, I suddenly had the feeling that every now and then someone was stroking my head. My husband always liked to do such in cozy togetherness. Also, while watching TV, he also liked to stroke my head. And since then, over and over again, it felt for me like someone was stroking my head. And this really happened quite often. For example, my youngest daughter went to visit her sister, who still had 2 weeks before giving birth. She wanted to visit her before the baby came. I was in the do-it-yourself store to get something, and then the stroking of my head started. And it didn't stop at all until I thought, am I buying something wrong? and the stroking might be my husband. Am I buying something wrong? Then I gave my daughter a quick call just to see how she was doing. And she said, Mom, the birth has started. I'm taking care of Eric now, and the others are on their way to the hospital. And that's probably what my husband was trying to tell me. But at the beginning, when the stroking was so insanely frequent, I thought at some point I had a nervous disorder. And after thinking that, the stroking stopped for a while, so that I realized, oh, he was indeed the one stroking my head. You then did some mediumistic training where you had experiences, wherein you learned something more about your husband. Before I started, however, I researched this medium on the internet, and I found out she was a student of Paul Meek, a very well-known medium. He organizes mediumistic evenings, and I decided to attend one. I didn't know him before, only after I had looked into this issue. He is also a pianist. He plays the piano very well, and a whole auditorium full of people listened to him playing the piano. He also told jokes, and what was funny was that he told this particular rabbit joke, which I became aware of only later on. I really know a lot of jokes, and I do collect them. Well, Paul Meek saw deceased people time and again, and he assigned them to those present, telling them about the deceased respectively. And it was very impressive to see how much his explanations were affecting these people. But there was nothing concerning my own experiences, yet obviously, with the ones of the people he was talking to, I hoped that if something matches together with me, if something resonates for me, it would certainly be the bunny in Australia. However, his joke did not happen in Australia, but in another country. Anyway, I told some of those present about my experiences. Some of them were very interested. Others were very positive about this and were sharing their own experiences. I had told them about the deathbed visions of my brother-in-law's friend and this incident with his favorite aunt who had passed on. A friend of mine, a neurologist, thanked me. She had a near-death experience herself, but she was told in the hospital that it was all just hallucinations, although she was in fact able to tell about things that had happened quite far away, and thus she couldn't have had previous knowledge. She couldn't have made it up. Others were restrained. They were afraid. Maybe I rattled their worldview a bit, but to be honest, if I hadn't had this experience with my husband, things like that would also feel strange for me. I would as well be frightened if I would feel a spirit around me. So I can understand that. I then decided to do some mediumistic training offered by the student of Paul Meek. I was just interested in it. There were 20 participants in this course, and we were told right from the start that we shouldn't talk about ourselves. And if we did talk, then only about something else that has nothing to do with us. We were taught to relax and were told about the spiritual world. It was also affirmed that only those who were entitled to be there had joined. You were supposed to ask for a symbol, and you were given questions to be asked and passed on during the session. And at the end of the first 2 weekends, in this first course, a stone was to be drawn, and those two who drew the same stone then were working together. Even though I had not spoken a word at all to my partner beforehand, I then relaxed through meditation, whereby the image of a nice elderly lady appeared in my head. I asked her if she is the mother. She denied, saying she is the grandmother, whereupon my brain started working again, and I thought, it's good that it's the grandmother, because if she's the mother, she could still be alive, and this would be kind of embarrassing. Anyway, I had gotten some inspiration, but some other things besides the grandmother who appeared to me were rather irrelevant to me. And when I had passed it on to my partner, She said that I had described her grandmother perfectly, and this was exactly the relevant thing. I also told her that I actually do not want to pass on other things to her because I find them somehow trivial or somewhat kitschy. Then it was my partner's turn, and the first thing she passed on to me was the symbol of a rabbit, which of course I was delighted about. She also said there was a man, but she was as unsettled about this because she didn't know that I was a widow. That's why she first gave me a questioning glance, saying, "A husband is appearing to me." Only then did I tell her that my husband had passed on. So then she did pass on the symbol with the rabbit to me. She also described him to me in detail, with his mustache, also telling me everything about him, also what he was like. And she said he would tell her a story. Well, she saw him in green dungarees, with safety shoes and a hard hat on his head, somewhere in a forest. She saw a tree fall over, but she didn't know why. Anyway, my husband did indeed take instructions on felling trees. It was a hobby of his to be able to cut down trees. Whereupon he had the forester instruct him which trees he was allowed to cut down. And so he was felling and chopping for our stove. And I also found a photo of this from 2008. The second part of his course took place again on a weekend, and it was about calling spiritual helpers to us. And she said, "Well, now the spiritual helpers are coming, and you can also feel something." And at that moment, it started again. I again had this very intense feeling that someone was stroking my head. So I was rather moved by this and said, "Connie, it's the spiritual helpers who are supposed to come, not you." Anyway, I was rather confused by this and found that this course was no longer suitable for me. And due to COVID, which came shortly afterwards, I discontinued the course. I didn't want to either, although it was interesting. But there were many other things waiting for me at home, both professionally and with my grandchildren. Nevertheless, it was an interesting experience for me. So, Birgit, what impact did all these experiences have on your worldview? The experience with this encounter in the theater had brought me a lot further in terms of the answers to the questions I had as a teenager. I think that consciousness is immortal, although science keeps trying to prove that our consciousness comes from the brain, that it is brain made. But this cannot be proven yet. My husband, as a scientist, used to say, "You look at something, you put forward a thesis, and you try to prove this thesis. And if something cannot be proven or something isn't right, then the thesis has to be changed." I think that science would have to change its thesis a bit, in the sense that consciousness is immortal and independent of the brain. But it was already in the last century, around 1900, when scientists were convinced that they knew everything that could or should be known or that existed, until Einstein came along and threw all that overboard again. So I think that things will still change in this respect. At least I do hope that science will still find out what it's really all about. I believe that life goes on after death, and I think and hope that my husband will come and get me. Thank you very much for this interview. You are most welcome.